Welcome back to Historical Context. Today, we go back to Plymouth and talk about some of the same old stuff we've been talking about, tension between the Plymouth colonists that occurred in the late 1620s. But before we get into today's episode, I want to provide a few announcements in regards to the podcast that are exciting. Today is our 50th episode. It's a wonderful accomplishment to reach 50 episodes of Historical Context, and I've been amazed at the growth in the viewership of this podcast so far. I would love, if you love it as much as I love doing it, for you to share this podcast with anybody else that you know who you think would like hearing history stories from those who tell it. I also want to talk about the historical speeches. Last Friday, we posted a historical speech by Charles I when he dissolved Parliament. While that is considered more of a big item in English history, I want to note that it really represents a separation point there between Charles I and the Puritans and helps lead to the big immigration of Puritans over to Massachusetts Bay. So while many people consider that significant to European history, it's huge for American history as well. This Friday, we're going to do it again with John Winthrop's Of Christian Charity. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I do, and I'm definitely looking for feedback from viewers on whether or not we should continue to do speeches like those. It's something I think is very exciting and needed for not just researchers, but people interested in history too. So let's jump back into Plymouth, and also know too with Massachusetts Bay, last week we left off in the year 1630. It's going to be several weeks before we get back there, because after this week, we're going to be looking to move further down the colonies and talk about what's going to happen in Middle America in the 1620s and 30s. So Massachusetts Bay stopped last week at 1630 with John Winthrop's arrival. We will return there several weeks from now, but for now, it's Plymouth on Historical Context. And the last time we were there, it was 1626. John Oldham had been banished, John Lyford had been banished, and Roger Conant had been exited as well. And 1627 was a significant year because it marked the 7th anniversary of the colony and that prior agreed upon repayment of debts to the merchants. And the adventurer merchants agreed to reduce their debt to the colony in exchange for 1,800 pounds sterling. And this agreement was made, but the colonists weren't quite sure how to pay it. So they wanted to reduce some of their debt, but they had to run around and come up with the money to do it. It took 7 or 8 households to come together to fund this transaction, but they pulled it off and managed then to distribute those shares that they repurchased amongst the colonists. As part of the agreement, a division of cattle and livestock would occur amongst all of the colony's residents. In May 1627, the division of cattle was executed, and the document, which has survived, precisely names each person in the colony, all 156 of them. The fact that it was a livestock division is actually not as historically significant as the fact that it was an accurate census. During the year, they took in a group of Englishmen who were actually seeking Virginia but had gotten lost and sick. So they take these people in, they offer them food, they restore their health, and Bradford made the observation that these men were relieved that the natives knew how to speak English. And this is a difference from life in Virginia. The group eventually left, and according to Bradford, quote, they acknowledged their gratitude from Virginia, so they must have made it safely. Later that year, Bradford received correspondence from the Dutch that they had set up a colony in New York, and they were requesting an alliance against the Spanish. Bradford's response focused more on their gratitude for the housing of the Puritans in the Netherlands and on trade. He inquired about the price of beaver and otter and what other commodities they deal with. This correspondence would trigger years of a solid trade relationship between the two colonies. Bradford then shifts his focus on the remaining separatists still in Leiden, Netherlands. Remember, they didn't all come over, and now it's 1627, and while it's 7 years into the colony, it's actually 20 years since the separatists left England for the Netherlands. Bradford and the government also wanted to fully discharge the debts of the colony and bring its ownership structure under the colony itself. In July 1627, an Articles of Agreement was made between the Plymouth colony and William Bradford, Miles Standish, and Isaac Allerton. The agreement stated that the three men would reduce the colony's debts in exchange for free fishing rights, free trade rights, and the collection of 3 bushels of corn or 6 pounds of tobacco by the other colonists each year for 6 years. The agreement also set up an internal trade price between clothing and corn, and the agreement itself would expire in 6 years. Isaac Allerton left for England with this agreement and would work to bring additional Puritans over. Allerton's trip was successful as the terms proposed were agreed to, and he returned in 1628. He also returned with a patent to establish a trading post at the Kennebec River, which is in Maine, near the abandoned colony of Popham, and it's been 20 years since the colony was abandoned. The Dutch also visited Plymouth in 1628 and engaged in trade with the colony, as the Pilgrims sold them tobacco in exchange for their linens. At this point, a man named Thomas Morton enters the story. Morton, by all accounts, was not a Puritan. He had first traveled to the New World in 1622 on an exploratory expedition and left the Plymouth colony in 1623, complaining that the colonists were intolerant. We've kind of heard this story from others before. He returned in 1624 when Captain Wollaston had settled a trading post called Mount Wollaston. There, Morton befriended the Algonquian tribes, which he considered more civilized than the Plymouth colony. That's interesting. Morton abandoned the Wollaston colony in 1626 in favor of settling his own colony after he discovered the captain was selling indentured servants into slavery in Virginia. That's interesting. The trading post that Morton established was renamed Marymount. Bradford felt that Wollaston was an honest man and that Morton had deceived the group into following him. Bradford goes on to mention the maypole at Marymount in his writings. Let's have a look. They set up a maypole, drinking and dancing about it for several days at a time, inviting Indian women for their consorts, dancing and frisking together, to say nothing of worse practices. So it's clear that the Plymouth Pilgrims did not approve of the maypole at Marymount. Bradford refers to the maypole as their idol, and he notes that Thomas Morton is eventually sent back to England, likely to face charges, and at that time, John Endicott shows up and starts the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which we talked about last week. But this would not be the last we hear of Thomas Morton. Morton, according to Bradford, would return and begin trading ammunition with the natives. Oh boy. Bradford then states that the natives were now well armed with guns and gunpowder, even when the colonists were not. This may be evidenced by the fact that Morton's Marymount colony was raided by the Salem Puritans in the winter of 1629, and a cache of corn was seized. One must wonder how the group got so much corn. And at this point, Bradford's tone towards the natives suddenly changes. Let's have a look. Oh, the horror of this villainy! How many Dutch and English have lately been killed by Indians, thus furnished, and no remedy is provided. The evil has increased. The blood of their brothers has been sold for profit. So harsh words there by Bradford, and clearly I think he's foreshadowing a more dire situation of the relationship between the natives. Bradford stated that the colonists began writing Morton requesting that he desist from his activities. The claim is that Morton replied with scorn and continued his trade with the natives. The colonists then advised him that it was a violation of their safety and the king's laws. Morton refused, and Bradford noted that he, quote, had to be taken by force. So Miles Standish and an armed force went and physically seized Thomas Morton. Morton and his men were too drunk to defend themselves, according to Bradford, and Morton was then sent back to England again with letters detailing his behavior. But what happened to him? Let's have a look at the writing. He was dispatched to the Council of New England with letters giving information of his behavior, entrusted to a representative. But Morton fooled this man after he had left there, and though he went to England, nothing was done to him. He was not as much as rebuked, and he returned the following year. And yet, as I sit here again, I'm going to tell you we have not heard the end of Thomas Morton. We will be doing future episodes about this man, and from what I'm hearing, it's going to be a little entertaining. Then Bradford goes on to mention Isaac Allerton bringing a new minister over, but the man was, quote, crazed in the brain and had to go back to England. Bradford then mentions that Allerton began to exhibit suspicious behavior, with his goods being mixed up with the colonies, and therefore the mixing of the money. And this is talking about that trade. Despite these problems, in 1629, Allerton was able to sell a trade partnership in England that brought more Puritans over from the Netherlands. Well, that's good. They'd been there 22 years. Bradford goes on to mention his happiness with the settling of Salem and the Massachusetts Bay, as it brought more Puritans to the New World. So they're happy to see more Puritan colonies pop up. After the Leiden contingent came over, the 3 bushel of corn tax was murmured by other colonists as being unfair, so it was suspended. Allerton continues to fall out of favor with the Plymouth Pilgrims after he fails to sustain the trading post in Maine, and he brings Thomas Morton back in his 1629 return voyage from England. Morton was not only brought back by Allerton, but Allerton housed him in Plymouth. Oh boy, I bet that was tense. Morton would eventually relocate to Massachusetts Bay, and as I've said before, we will be talking about him in the future. Bradford goes on to describe Allerton as being increasingly ineffective at trade and suspicious of his activities. Like Thomas Morton, there's going to be more to discuss with Isaac Allerton as well. Now that we get to 1630 in Plymouth, I think it's a good time to conclude our colonization of New England unit. And there will be more colonies popping up in New England, but many of them will actually be born out of the existing colonies versus immigration from England. And so at this time in colonial history, the middle colonies, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, they start to get established. And that's where the next unit is going to focus, as well as some of the events in Virginia. And we'll start that next time on Historical Context.